Welcome to another video lesson from the Jelly Roll Club. Today we're going to be working on a cute thread catcher for our sunflower pincushion. In order to do that, you're going to need 10 by 13 main fabric, a 10 by 14 3/4 lining fabric, some binding material, a little bit of duck canvas, 10 inches by 16 inches, a fusible quilt batting, 9 by 15 inches, and a scrap for creating a hanging tab. First, you begin by cutting all of your pieces. Please check your handout that's down in the description that has all of the measurements for the handy dandy thread catcher. But cut your pieces into two rectangles that measure 10 inches by 8 inches. If you don't have duck canvas, you can use interfacing like I did that provides stability to the thread catcher. Cut your batting in half so that you have two rectangles that are 9 inches by 7 3/8. And make sure that you create a little sandwich. First, I used pins to just make sure that all of my pieces are the same size. Next, I tried to decide which piece of fabric to fuse my batting to. You can either fuse it to the backing or you can fuse it to the front fabric. It doesn't matter which way you do it. Either way is fine as long as you line it up even with the top and leave a 1/2 inch margin on the sides. When you've completed that and you're satisfied that your sandwich is ready, you can go ahead and fuse. If you do not have fusible batting, you can always use a little bit of spray baste, or you can simply pin it together. In this case, I used Pellon fusible batting. Once you have completely fused the batting to your front and your back pieces, then you're ready to begin the next step. In this case, I'm going to pin it so that my pieces don't shift, but it's not necessary. And now I'm ready to go on to the next step. First, I secured my layers by sewing a straight line about a 1/2 inch away from the top edge. And then I used another ruler to kind of visualize what it would look like if I made lines of different widths across for my quilting lines. And so I decided that I wanted to draw a grid. And so on the back side of my duck fabric, I drew a grid using a pencil and a straight edge. And I drew my lines about 1 inch square. And these lines are the lines that I'm going to use to add quilting lines to my sandwich, which includes the duck canvas, the fusible batting, and the outside of my thread catcher fabric. You don't have to do straight lines like I'm doing. You can choose any quilting design of your choice, but I did the same exact thing to the second piece. Lined it up, centered the batting, fused all 3 layers together. Making sure that I ironed it from both sides. And then I was ready to repeat by creating quilting lines on the other side of my thread catcher. So I need a total of 2 pieces for my thread catcher that are 10 inches by 8 inches. Again, just like I did the first time, I drew a grid and I quilted using my walking foot on my sewing machine. Once I have quilted both halves of my thread catcher, I'm going to give them a quick trim and square them up. And then I'm going to cut a 2.5 inch square from the bottom side of each of my rectangles. So those 2 rectangles that are 10 by 8, I'm going to cut away using a sharp pair of scissors, a 2.5 by 2.5 inch square. Again, you're doing this to the bottom of your quilted panels, which are 10 by 8 inches. You're cutting away a 2.5 inch square. And remember to measure twice and cut once. I like how the grid pattern worked out on this one, but you could certainly quilt these pieces using a free motion pattern or just straight lines, horizontal or vertical. But anyway, I did mine in a grid and I like how it turned out. Once you've cut all 4 of those corners, you're going to take the bottom and you're going to put these right sides together and you're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam. This is super important. All of the seams for this step are 1/2 inch seams on the sides and a 1/2 inch seam across the bottom. When you're done, you're going to press those seams open. If you have a pressing ham, it really helps during this step, but if you don't, just use your fingers and crease those. Those are 1/2 inch seams. Press those seams nice and flat, press them open. It'll reduce the bulk. And then you're going to do the same thing for the sides. You're going to press them flat. Once you have finished, you're going to pin those ends closed. And you're going to sew those ends again with a 1/2 inch seam, just like you did the bottom and the sides. If you have a sleeve board, it's very helpful to use. I don't have one, but I'm definitely going to be hunting down a sleeve board if I make more of these little thread catchers for gifts this year. Okay, now you're ready to sew the 2 bottom sides. Once the 2 bottom sides are complete, it should look like this. So it should stand up on its own, which is why you use duck cloth and batting. Now you can turn your little thread catcher with the right sides to the outside. If you wanted to make this thread catcher using some orphan blocks, you certainly could. So any scraps that you have work well for this project. Okay, I'm inspecting my work and it looks like all of my seams are nice and even and my thread catcher is nice and square. Now for the lining. The lining is a little bit different than the outsides because it does not have a bottom seam. So you're going to fold it in half, that 10 inch by 14 3/4 inch piece. And you're going to cut out pieces that are 2.5 inches by 1 3/4. So I'm going to draw those, cut those little corners out. We have to account for the seam allowance. It's not there, which is why this is not a 2.5 by 2.5 inch square. Okay, once I've cut those away, now I'm going to place it right sides together and I'm going to sew the 2 sides. Then I'm going to open that seam to reduce the bulk. Press it open on both sides, and you're sewing this again with a 1/2 inch seam. And then you're going to pin those ends closed, and then you're going to sew using a 1/2 inch seam. Now you're going to make your little hanging tab. So I used 2 pieces that were 2.5 inches by 5. I put them right sides together and I stitched down both sides using a 1/4 inch seam. I turned it right sides out and I pressed my seams flat. Doesn't matter which way they go as long as it is flat. Once I'm done pressing, I'm going to top stitch down both sides of this little hanging tab to give it some strength. So just sew down the sides. And when you're done, now you're ready to insert that little hang tab, the liner, and your binding all the way around. In my case, I added a double binding. One is going to stay folded down to be a little bit more decorative, and the other one is going to be folded to the inside like traditional quilt binding. So I played around with my binding to decide how I wanted it to look. I decided I wanted that folded over to help keep my thread catcher open. So I folded that brown lining downward, my matching binding inward, and now we are ready to begin the process of hand sewing our little thread catcher. I folded the outside binding downward and I stitched it down by hand. This does two things. It gave it a little bit of a decorative element to my thread catcher, and it also stabilizes that top edge so that my thread catcher stays open. If you wanted to, you could use a little bit of wire here if you had a floppy thread catcher, but in this case, it's not needed. Next, I turned that binding to the inside. I turned my entire thread catcher inside out, and I stitched the entire binding by hand towards the inside. Now I'm ready to go. It looks like my thread catcher is nice. It's staying open. It's nice and sturdy. And so I'm going to anchor that hanging tab to my sunflower so that I can glue it down to a little clay saucer that's like a 4-inch clay saucer, and I found that that fits my flower perfectly when I lay it in there. It just fits perfect, and it'll give it weight so that it doesn't fall off my sewing table. Okay, quilty friends, you're just going to take some needle and thread, and you're going to take some stitches to anchor that hanging tab to the back of your sunflower. Doesn't take very many stitches. I did maybe a dozen stitches that were not super tiny. All the way across. And I turned around, removed the pin, and came back down the other side and did more anchoring stitches across the top to just make it nice and secure. Okay, friends, that's about it. Once you attach that little tab to your thread catcher, you can go ahead and put a little bit of batting in that clay saucer, and then using a hot glue gun, you can attach it to the clay saucer. And the reason you would want to do that is to keep that flower from falling off of your sewing table. And now you are ready. The little thread catcher that matches the sunflower is complete, and you're ready to give it as a gift.